Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. Um, we're just going to wait for a few more people to join, and then we'll do some housekeeping, and talk about context engineering in AI today. Um, we're going to be talking all about how to use context in your localization strategy when working with AI orchestration layers. We feel this is a very relevant topic at the moment, especially because we're already seeing quite a big shift from more conventional technologies to solutions based on or using some form of AI. And that brings a lot of massive benefits with it, but also some challenges. So in the next hour or so, we'll be looking at context management and AI orchestration from a few different perspectives. Just a reminder that this session will be recorded. For anyone not yet aware, the recording will be shared with you afterwards as well. So in case you're unable to stay for the entire hour, we'll be able to share the recording afterwards. We'll also save some time for questions at the end. So please do leave your questions in the little question box. There might be a chat, or there might be a specific box for leaving questions. If you could just leave it there, then we can see it, and we'll pick some of those out during the last 15, 20 minutes or so. We'll see how far we get. By way of introduction, my name is Marjolein. I'm a solutions lead at Intento. We provide an AI orchestration layer in which we build custom AI translation solutions. And I'm joined by Sara Basile, product director at XTM. Sara, could I ask you to briefly introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah, and I lead product for the XTM platform. So, in practice, my job is about trying to turn seven different separate products into one integrated and composable platform. So, as you can imagine, it means kind of spending a lot of time in rooms where everyone agrees the future is agentic and autonomous, but then you need to go back to your desk and then figure out how to, let's say, rebuild the engine while the plane is in the air and full of passengers. So that's a lot of fun and a nice challenge. And I've been in localization technology myself for more than a decade right now, and I really think we're living in a very interesting time right now. So really looking forward for this discussion today. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Sarah. Excited to have you here. I'd like to just start by setting the stage a little bit and just introducing the topic of context and AI orchestration as well. Um, I always love it when I hear people say the localization industry is one of the first industries to really adopt the use of AI. That came even before generative AI. Neural machine translation was its predecessor, really, and we saw the first real business applications of neural MT by almost 10 years ago now. So that was a major shift at the time. Might feel like ages ago already, but it's not that long ago. And we're kind of at our next major shakeup of the translation technology already. So with the introduction of generative AI into translation pipelines, into localization strategies, we're seeing that we can address some of the limitations that older technologies have shown. And from the automatic translation perspective, the biggest limitation that we're seeing with at least traditional machine translation is that in a production pipeline, it can really only take in source text. Now, that's fundamentally different from how humans translate. In a natural human translation setting, humans always work with context. That context comes in many forms. Some of that context I might not even be aware of. It's the difference between a machine learning model and a human brain. A human translator doesn't just look at the source text, they look at other pieces of context. They also use their past knowledge of the subject to help them translate. They know certain rules, certain restrictions, instructions around how they should translate certain terms or phrases, and all of that is processed at the same time. Now, generative AI or LLMs in terms of architecture, they're similar to machine translation models, but the key difference lies in what they can take as input. Um, LLMs can actually take in other forms of input as well than just the source text. They can take in lots of other forms of context. And as a result, we've kind of suddenly closed or maybe started to close, come much closer to closing one of the most important gaps between human and automatic translation. Um, But context can mean many different things, and it can also live in many different places. In order to use it to our benefit, it somehow needs to be fed to the system at the right moment, in the right format, and only when it's required. Now, what we've learned over the last few years is that if you take this powerful technology and connect it to the same tech stack and same information flow that was designed for older technologies, you don't really get the benefits there. Your system has to be redesigned in order to reap those benefits. So, where previous versions of localization platforms and even file formats were kind of built for these older technologies, they were never really designed to pass context to the system. And so we might be in this very tightly designed world that just isn't built for the current technology to work in its best way possible. So the most important thing is to find a way to provide relevant context in a meaningful way and in a reliable way as well. Um, and that requires just a full orchestration layer, and that's what we'll be unpacking today. Um, Now, to start with, I've thrown around some words already that different people listening in may have different definitions of. So I'd like to start with defining these concepts first, and then also understanding from you, Sara, how you define them. Um, let's start with context. That's the main buzzword we're talking about at the moment. I'm talking specifically context from a localization perspective. So when we talk about context this next hour or so, um, we're talking about anything that kind of helps determine not just what a word means, but how it should be translated in a specific situation, for a specific audience, for a specific product or a specific piece of content. And that information should be contained in assets that we're very familiar with generally. So some very basic examples could be terminology or glossaries. So terms that explain what a product is called, what a concept is called, how it is expressed in different languages. Past translations stored in translation memories can also provide helpful context, although they can be a bit in isolated forms. We might talk about gender markers, so maybe a database that shows named individuals that you might come across in a piece of content to translate and understanding what their pronouns are and whether there are any gender markers there to translate. Um, Sara, from your perspective, do you agree with this definition of what context is, or are you seeing additional forms or different forms of context from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. And that's a great idea to start with concepts so we make sure that we talk about the same things. So I would like to build on what you just described. And I really think that what we see from most of the organizations that we talk with, especially at the enterprise level, is that context can span across different layers. So it's really not just one single thing. And we can really look at context from different angles. Historically, all of these context layers have been siloed, and I think this is also one of the key challenges that we're facing. I think one of the first concepts of context is a structural context. So, for example, knowing that content like a string or a piece of text lives inside like a regulated PDF file or a PowerPoint presentation or a data map. So this structure itself already carries meaning and context, because if you lose it or if you break it, you already lose the compliance and the traceability. And then we have the semantic context, which is close to what you just described. So really what anyone might have in a translation memory, terminology, or style guides. So this is also what we are tackling at XTM, because we want to make sure that we modernize also the way we look at semantic context, so linguistic assets, historically speaking, because we also have the goal of enabling context to be queried by any service and any AI agent, for example, at runtime. So that knowledge always lives there in a place and can be injected in the right moment. And then I would say there is a third layer, which is intent context. I think this is really the tricky part. For example, knowing that a piece of content or a text is a disclaimer or a CTA button. So This distinction can completely change the way AI handles it, because also it changes the way humans handle it when they have to translate this specific text. So you need some sort of parsing approach that doesn't just extract strings or text, but also is able to identify the intent and can preserve its structural integrity. So by the time content reaches this AI layer, it can already carry the metadata envelope. So yeah, a complex concept for sure.
Definitely. It's and those are exactly the types of context that when a human translator looks at a piece of context in situ, they know what that means. That's the kind of information they just have, and they might not even notice that. But that's all the kinds of stuff that we need to think about when we're talking about automating this kind of work.
Yeah.
And when we talk about AI orchestration or orchestration in general, what do we mean here? I think those are the two concepts we really want to define and ask you to start on this one. I think Intento and XCM, even though we live in the same realm, we're quite different platforms with a few touch points. So there's likely to be maybe a slight difference in perspective there. But I'll ask you to start on what you define as AI orchestration layers.
Sure. So orchestration from the XDM perspective is quite a broad concept again. So it's like looking at this as an horizontal layer again. So it's about asking a quite broad set of questions. For example, where does the content come from? Or what kind of content is this? Is it like, for example, again, legal disclaimer or a marketing headline or a clinical trial document? What is also the risk profile, for example, associated with this content? What are the compliance constraints for this customer in this region, in this specific moment? Does the content need human translation, LLM, or maybe a combination of both? Or, for example, if there are any specific budget approval constraints or budget constraints. And also what comes after the translation. So where does the content need to travel back to? Is it a CMS or a video pipeline, a regulatory submission system? And also, what if something goes wrong? So who would be to notify, for example? So those are not just translation service questions, those are really more business workflow questions. And they require really a broad orchestration layer with a broader scope. So in the XDM ecosystem, orchestration is really about deciding which service, AI or not, to call with, for example, what content, with what context envelope, under which compliance rules, or what the results, what to do with the result. So it's the layer, for example, that understands a trigger coming from any source like a CMS developer tool and so on, is able also to evaluate the content against specific rules, for example, business rules, is also able to assemble the context envelope around it, the linguistic assets, so that knowledge, and is also able to route this content to any appropriate service, could be like MT or LLMs or specialized services like Intento. So this governance is what really is really a key component in the idea of orchestration at XDM. So yeah, this is how I would summarize that.
Nice. I think there's quite a lot of overlap there, definitely, but especially when you mentioned business rules a few times. Translation pipelines don't necessarily have only linguistic rules to abide by. It's very much business workflows as well and business decisions that need to be made. So there's quite a much wider set of requirements to adhere to there. I think when we look at orchestration from the Intento perspective, like you mentioned already, we're talking specifically about the moment that that content reaches the AI service. And in that pipeline, there's another AI orchestration layer that pulls together different pieces of context in order to translate or transform a piece of content. So again, it's a structured system. It sits between content sources and translation output. And it knows what to bring in at the right time, exactly. It can work in conjunction with localization platforms as just the translation step within a localization platform, or it can work on its own as well, because all it needs is an input of text that it needs to process, and it can then independently consult other sources where context lives and then handle the entire translation pipeline on its own. And it does that through the use of agents within that orchestration layer, which we'll touch up on a little bit later as well. Um, Important to mention as well, that layer might have nothing to do with AI in some of the elements. There might be some non-AI powered elements like checks and balances or failover steps or conditional steps that depend on the input or the output of every step within that workflow. The orchestration layer decides which steps are taken based on the conditions of a previous step, and ultimately then delivers a translation that meets all of the requirements, linguistic or business requirements that have then been built into that workflow. So a few separate touch points, but definitely living in different realms there. So we've defined the definitions of these concepts, context and AI orchestration. When we bring those two concepts together, the next thing we kind of need to think of is delivery and how to pull that context in at the right time, as we've already mentioned. When I first mentioned during the introduction to this session, is that current tech stacks and translation workflows, they were designed for a world where you pass a source string, you get a translation back, and that's kind of it. I mean, I am oversimplifying it now, but that's a general sense of it. And when we look at most platforms, translation platforms, or even just localization file formats, they don't really have a native way to pass rich context alongside the translation unit. So that could be metadata or a relevant translation memory segment. So in the context of what we've just been discussing, that could be a potential limitation, the current formats and systems that we're working with. So I'd love to hear more, Sara, what you're doing at XTM to begin to solve that problem. How do you deliver context to XDM or within XDM or from XDM to another source? And how are you approaching the challenge of passing that richer context?
Yeah. I think at this point, this is where we can start to slightly reframe the concept of context being delivered to the TMS, because also something that you were mentioning in the very beginning, like the traditional TMS technology was not built with that purpose in mind, and now we start to see the first bottlenecks around it. So, and I think this is also how we're addressing the challenge at XTM. So we are evolving XTM more into the place where context is not just delivered to, but it actually can even generate and most of all is governed and then dispatched to the correct service. So back to the orchestration point that we were talking about before. So indeed, traditionally, as you said, so a TMS received a file and then returned a translated file. So that context lives upstream in the CMS, DAM, or whatever source, like developer environment, whatever sort of we might be talking about. So rather than asking how does the context get into the TMS, the question that we're asking ourselves is how does XDM dispatch context to the right downstream service? And as you said, could be AI service or not, and especially at the right moment. So for example, in practice, this would mean when a document or just any content enters our ecosystem, then the structure would be preserved, intent would be tagged, and metadata also attached. And then let's say, enriched content then would sit in the platform. So when we call an AI service, that could be our own LLMs or external entities, or again, a service like Intento, we would then be in a position to pass not just that piece of content, but also the full context envelope and not just the bare string. So critically also this will happen at runtime, so without having to retrain models, for example, on customer data. So all the approved assets and the approved knowledge like brand terminology, relevant TM matches or style constraints would all be injected at the time the content gets routed. And as you also said before, this context might live in different places. So there's also something which is very important to us, the capability of being composable enough to understand how to tap into the place where the knowledge sits. Could be in XDM, could be outside, but in our idea, then XDM has to be able to consume that context, doesn't matter where it lives. So to directly answer the question is that we're not just passing a richer context into the TMS, it's more about evolving XDM into the platform that is able to assemble, govern, and route that context across different services in the workflow.
Right. That requires quite a lot of change management from that perspective. Um, and when we talk beyond just the file format and the creating the processes that can inject those that context into the content, um, like you mentioned already, we're seeing a lot of context can live in systems that they're not even connected to the translation pipeline. So I don't know, for example, an asset containing a company directory, like I mentioned before, the gender markers, um, company directory with names of individuals, has gender forms, pronouns, the ones that we need to use. Quite important, especially when you're trying to avoid bias in automatic translation. Or even just a product database that has information that's not in the glossary, that's not somewhere else. That information very often exists, but it's upstream of the translation workflow and it doesn't always make its way down. Um, Now, leaving that context upstream, of course, whether that's the CMS or any other system where that information lives, if that's not passed to the translation pipeline, we run the risk that a significant amount of that context could have already been lost when it reaches any kind of translation workflow. Um, so we tend to advocate for better integration in general between localization platforms, content sources, the translation layer. Um, how does that work in practice for you? How do you think about connecting and making sure that that context actually is not just governed in XCM, but actually is originating or even like that XCM is the source of truth, so to say. How do you see that managed?
Mm-hmm. So I would answer this question in like two ways. So I would say now concretely how the process would work right now and also where we're heading to. So today XDM is, as you said, quite connected to a wide variety of other ecosystems or platforms. And we achieve that through XDM Connect. So XDM as a platform can be connected to things like CMSs or for example, repositories or marketing tools. So this content flows in the platform from these systems, gets processed and flows back. So that part is quite mature. So those connections are obviously very good at moving content. So the next step is how to make sure that they're also good at moving context around the content. And what we do now in that direction is today is more about the linguistic context. So this is something that I want to make more concrete because it's already differentiated, in my opinion. So when XDM, for example, sends content to an LLM for translation or for scoring, so it's also not about just treating the content by itself without any context. So it's also about trying and sending as much context as possible, which lives already in the platform. So would be content plus relevant TM matches or proof terminology or glossary style guides. So all these instructions would be assembled and injected at the moment when that LLM call is made. And this is also the good part about it is that that context then would be again injected at runtime, so it doesn't need any retraining, for example, any model retraining, for example. So it also means that the advantage of customers that already have spent that time and effort curating their assets for, like, for example, years or decades, they would already benefit from that because they would get translations that are really grounded in all of this approved brand terminology and historical translation decisions every single time. So that's something which is real today, and I would say so it's also live. The same also applies to quality scoring. So when the quality scoring mechanism in XDM evaluates the translation, it's not just about checking things in abstract or without context. It's also about checking the customer's own approved terminology, style guide. So the same guardrails that we put around translation can also be put around quality. So The foundation is there. The direction we're moving towards is more extended that principle farther upstream. So back to the beginning of the webinar when we were talking about what context is. So it's about extending that to understanding the intent. So for example, is it like a legal disclaimer or CTA? Some of that context already lives in some of the, let's say, CMS metadata or the DAM that we might connect to, and on in some other brand guidelines documents. So that distinction should travel with the content from its source and not be figured out manually, let's say halfway through the workflow. So this is the direction we're moving towards. Kind of translating or changing the connect layer from a pure connectivity pipe to more of a context preserving fabric.
Right. Instead of just pulling naked content, so to say, for a lack of a better word, but pulling an entire package of what you need in order to understand that content and how to translate that content properly or in the right context.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like that would close a lot of gaps in terms of interconnectivity. But I like to move on to the space where then automatic translation happens now, which is in the translation pipeline or AI service, how you mentioned it as well. I am calling it automatic translation because machine translation just doesn't really cut it anymore when generative AI is in the mix. So this is the moment where the moment within the pipeline where the actual translation happens by the model. And this step is also being transformed massively these days by just the introduction of LLMs acting as the translation model. We've evolved from our, conventional, I don't want to call it conventional, but it is neural machine translation providers, where in previous situations, we'd see neural machine translation models handle the translation of the content. That may have been a trained machine translation model. We would regularly maintain that by updating it with clean translation memories, maybe once a year, maybe once every 6 months. Maybe would have some terminology features applied to that model as well, but that would cover most of what the MT model would do here. There might be some additional benefits for certain providers, but that would be the main things you could achieve. Now, in general, with this shift to using LLMs to provide the translation output instead, and knowing that these models can work with on-the-fly context instead of just static training, what we see a lot is this natural instinct of, let's just put all that context into the prompt and let the LLM handle it. That instinct comes from many different angles. We see it come a lot from non-localization stakeholders, so leadership, maybe not localization experts who speak business language. They don't necessarily speak localization language. They often ask this question, like, why can't an LLM just do it? And I think most of us will be localization professionals here. I think we can all agree that just let an LLM do it. That doesn't really work at scale when you're running a sophisticated strategy. At the very minimum, with working with large language models for translation, you need retrieval augmented generation, so RAG. We would need to selectively pull in the right context at the right moment rather than loading everything in at once. But even RAG is not necessarily suitable for every type of context that we need to pull in. When we talk about off-the-shelf RAG, it's widely available and it's based on vector embeddings. It was built for a non-localization task. It was built for question answering and information search, which uses semantic matching. And almost none of the tasks in actual localization pipelines require that type of task. You need different types of matching when you work with localization or RAG for localization. So just a few examples, you'd have terminology, for instance, that requires lexical matching. You need to find the exact term, not the most semantically similar one. That would kind of defeat the purpose. Translation memories as well. If you're injecting translation memory segments into a large language model pipeline, it works best with fuzzy matching, like the way that we're used to, which is string similarity. Just a few examples, but each type of context requires a different retrieval function. So treating them all the same causes quality degradation because you might not be retrieving the right pieces of information you need in order to produce the output that meets your requirements. And if you don't do that, your setup is just really not fit for purpose and might actually be defeating the whole purpose there. And that's just one example. That's maybe one of the more major ones, but it's just one of the reasons why a localization strategy has so much more risks and dependencies than can be solved by just calling an LLM. Um, Now, let's say we have well-structured RAG. We've solved that, and it pulls in the context correctly into your prompt. Um, you still, even then, won't be able to do that successfully in a single call to an LLM. There are two main reasons for that I'd like to talk about. The first one is what we would call attention loss, and the second is what we'd refer to as separation concerns. So, firstly, when we talk about attention loss, in short, that means gets or a prompt gets, either a prompt or a context window for an LLM, the less reliable the model actually becomes at following all of those instructions. So requirements that are either like less frequent or there's not as noticeable in the prompt, they might get dropped if they're drowned in other instructions, or they might not get applied consistently. And that also, like I said, applies to the context window. We've seen many studies, Intento has done studies and non-Intento studies as well that show that LLM output quality really significantly degrades the bigger the context window gets. Um, an average window is about 1,000 to 2,000 tokens. If you go very much beyond that, it has actually model follows those instructions. Now you do still see models going, our 4.5 Pro has a context window of 20,000 tokens. And that's true, like technically you can physically put that content in there, but that doesn't mean the model is going to digest it well and actually follow all of those instructions and apply them correctly. So that's attention loss. Now, the second reason why a single just call to an LLM is not a great idea is separation of concerns, as I mentioned. So if you put all of your requirements and instructions into one single prompt, then any change you make to one requirement or one rule or one instruction, that risks breaking something else. That's the same problem that software engineers solve with modular code. They instead of like writing one giant script that does everything at once, they work with building blocks that can be taken out of their total structure and reused or serviced or troubleshooted separately. But that means if the process breaks, you can easily find that one part of the total structure that's breaking it, and then you can repair that part instead of staring at an entire script and wondering what went wrong. So similar to that type of approach, the alternative to just calling an LLM is working with agentic workflows, and that's where we talk a lot about agents. Now, an agent, as we see it, is a combination of prompts, but also connectors to content sources, and they own a specific requirement. They're not just a step that calls a large language model. Part of it, maybe calling a large language model, yeah, but it's not just that. It's a unit of responsibility, an agent. It's also not just a workflow that chains LLM calls together. It's much more than that. That's not enough either. If you're just chaining LLM calls, then you run the risk of one call translates or transforms the text in a certain way, and then the next call is going to break what the previous one has done. So in that way, you can see errors compound very quickly. And so you have to look at similar ways in which humans work in teams. So think of like the Rachi framework. One person is responsible, one person is accountable, one person's consulted and informed. And that's kind of how it works with agentic workflows as well. So some agent is responsible for that specific step, others are consulted or informed. Now that's just an example of how that would work, and how agents could have different dimensions that touch different systems. But ultimately, what I've just described is this mostly applies to translating the content or transforming the actual content, so the actual translation pipeline. I know that's just one thing. That's just one part of what happens in a localization platform, as we have agents governing that pipeline. How do you, Sara, see that currently being realized in XDM?
Yeah, and also I think the audience will say the same. Thank you for this really great explanation about agents. I really think you touched on a great aspect of what agents really are. Definitely from the XDM's point of view, especially if we talk about agentic cooperation. And as we briefly mentioned at the beginning, so I think by now we all agree that a traditional TMS cannot manage that sort of cooperation through agents, and a system built around human task assignments, basically file hands-off or manual review queues like the traditional TMS, is definitely not the right architecture for a world where we expect now AI agents to do like 80% of the work. So this is exactly why XDM is like with XDM, we don't want to position our technology anymore as a standard TMS. And we rather talk about agentic globalization platform because the scope of the orchestration that we are looking at, also through agentic, is definitely the end-to-end globalization pipeline, where the AI translation service is a very important part and constitutes the broader scope. But in the XDM architecture, we would have something which is, let's say, an orchestration core. So this part would decide, for example, for this piece of content, I will call a specific knowledge service for the context, for example, and then I will run it through a specific MT or LLM or invoke, for example, Intento service because it's most suitable for the guardrails that were set for that content. And if, for example, a score falls below a threshold, then I would trigger a human reviewer in the workbench. So each of these can be an agent or a service, and XDM would be then the platform that orchestrates and coordinates all of this. And what's also important to stress in our opinion is that this is all obviously API first and agent to agent compatible because XDM was built with interoperability in mind. Definitely, we don't want this to change, and also we don't want this to change in the Gen AI or agentic era. So whether external agents or from a customer or maybe from an Intento pipeline, anything should be able to trigger XDM's capabilities as tools. So that's the platform of the future that we're building towards.
Nice. That sounds exciting. Um, just as a last part, when we, especially what you're working towards, um, we talk to lots of enterprise localization teams, and when we ask them about what an ideal future looks like for them, we often get similar answers, even though there might be very different teams and different companies. Um, Humans design the translation process. AI carries it out. Humans are responsible for the governance. They define what's the standard, what is right, what is wrong. They set the expectations, the guardrails really, and they only review edge cases or when something goes wrong. But execution at scale, and this is what we then talk about scalable strategies as well. Execution at scale is done by AI. That's not no longer handled by humans because that means your strategy isn't scalable anymore if you're relying on um, large volumes of content, large process to be handled by humans. Um, that doesn't mean we have no human involvement, of course. In large enterprises, we see that human involvement is still very much there. Like certain information has restricted access for certain decisions, they carry compliance risks, so there might still be very much edge cases where humans definitely get involved. But in general, that's kind of the underlined here is that like, humans design the process, AI carries it out. And I know you've been thinking about what a localization platform could look like in the future with regards to that. So just for the last few minutes, I'd love to give you the floor to share how you see that evolving from XTM's perspective.
Sure, and thank you for the question. This is like the kind of question that I always very much look forward to answering, because I think you mentioned the governance part, so which is really key also in my opinion, and I also think this is where the entire industry really needs to land, and also the lens from which I would say anyone should evaluate any platform they are buying or even building. So. I think we both agree that the fundamental change that we are looking at, and by the way, I don't think we're talking about anything so far in the future. So we see really this shift really shaping how technology is being built today. And we see definitely that we are moving from humans that manage workflows to humans that rather govern the AI that, as you said, executes on those workflows. So those sound similar solutions, but from a technology provider perspective, architecturally speaking, we're talking about two completely different things. So in the old model, you have, for example, a project manager that logs into a dashboard and then creates a project and assigns the tasks, monitor the progress, chases vendors if they're not delivering, and then approves the delivery. So every decision point requires a human click or used to require a human click. So the human is in the workflow executing on these specific tasks. I think the model the entire industry is really moving and building towards is something where the human's role is about rather setting the guardrails. So is about stepping back and letting the AI execute within those guardrails and autonomously. So the human then in this constellation would be supposed to re-enter only when the AI hits, for example, specific boundaries or it cannot resolve alone, so it needs to escalate. So from a technology perspective or solution perspective, you obviously would need a place where those guardrails will need to be configured. So it's no longer about having a project dashboard, but having a set of controls managed by what we would call, for example, the globalization department lead or the platform admin, or maybe let's not start talking about roles because we hear new role definitions every day. But this person would no longer be a standard project manager in the traditional sense because it will not be about managing projects. It would be about defining rules of engagement for AI. So, for example, which LLMs are approved for which content type or what the acceptable risk thresholds would be for AI versus non-AI workflows. What is the knowledge foundation that has to be used? So TM, glossary, style guides. What are the compliance requirements that apply to specific regions or content domains? So this also obviously will have budget constraints. So those all are going to be components of those guardrails. So in this scenario, then the human would appear in two places. So for example, when the AI escalates, so for example, those guardrails are defined, but it's not enough for the AI to make a reasonable decision. Or the second scenario is what I would call more of a governance decision. So when the rules themselves need to be updated. This is also about this concept of self-curating, like the AI agents also self-curating themselves based on the outcomes of the previous actions. So I also would say that the experience that we're also building towards and the measure of success for our platform, and I think we are definitely not the only ones out there with that, is that success will mean how rarely our users would even need to log into the TMS UI at all, because we are looking at a scenario in which content enters via, for example, a trigger, and the platform behind the scenes is invisible, the governance is invisible, but obviously the quality is not. So I don't think that this platform, by the way, would make humans redundant. It's just about making the human judgment strategic again, because now humans are more overwhelmed by the operational noise, let's say, that currently consumes most of the localization managers' day. The future that we're aiming towards at XTM, I think is really what I generally believe is the right one for globalization at scales again, is to make the human strategic again.
Nice. That's reminds me of just generally the statement, the the example of a successful system isn't really how often people use it. It's how rarely they need to do anything about it. How rarely they need to intervene, basically, and that's kind of what we're working towards. Um, that's great. Nice. Thank you. Um, I think we have some minutes, 15 minutes approximately, for questions. So we'll start on some questions now. While I have a look through the questions that were submitted, everybody who is here, you'll see a quick poll pop up in a minute. So we'd love it if you could answer it. It would really help us. And then in the meantime, I'll have a look to see what questions we have here. Cool. All right. Um, let's see. Okay, let's start from. I think that's a question for you, Sada. I'll start with you. So, transitioning to context engineering sounds like a powerful step forward for quality. To help our teams prepare for this shift, what does the reality of building this context look like? And are there tools or, sorry, this poll keeps popping up. Are there tools or automated workflows in place to gather this metadata rather than relying on the team to compile it manually?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so great question. So I think so. Back to what we also mentioned before, and the concept of context. Probably a thing to address this question with the look. We can look at context in two different buckets because the approach will be different for each of them. So the first bucket will be the linguistic context, and I think this is where most of the organizations have already done a great job. So it would be like TMs, glossary, style, guide rules. We've seen this, obviously, we see more mature programs that have already these assets in a different state. The goal is to then have an infrastructure. So in XTM, they will be able to inject all this context at runtime, and that's also what is already working today. When we send then the content to the LLM for translation or scoring, then this is about automatically assembling all this content and context and then injecting this in the LLM call to then have a relevant and translation which is grounded in these assets and rules. The second bucket is more about intent and metadata, which is the biggest challenge in this context. So, for example, again, knowing if a string is a legal disclaimer or is a label or a CTA button. So this distinction really changes how AI handles the content. And this is where we are really, by the way, heavily investing right now. So I think the practical implication for teams from this perspective is significant because we won't be manually tagging every document anymore. So in the XTM's scenario, it would be about having a sort of ingestion layer that understands it. And what the team then would configure is rather the governance around it, as we said before. So for anything that would be classified as, for example, a regulatory warning, for example, then this LLM could be used because it's defined in the guardrails and so on. So to be realistic, the quality of that automated metadata extraction really depends on the content itself. So obviously, well-structured documents, for example, properly formatted data files or clean docs or structured XMLs, they would give any ingestion service really a very easy job. If we are talking, for example, about legacy PDFs that were maybe scanned, not sure from which source, then obviously that task is a little bit more challenging. My honest advice would be for teams, however, to prepare more by making sure that the linguistic assets are really mature and properly and clean enough to be able to be usable in the right way and in the right time by any platform that would be used in the right moment.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, clean assets are obviously the right way to go, but rather want to not create a lot of overhead in order to maintain those assets, of course. Let's see, any other? I see a question here. How do you handle situations where translation requirements conflict with each other inside a translation workflow? So, for example, terminology and formality or tone of voice produce incompatible outputs. Um, I'll answer this from an Intento perspective, because this is actually a really good question because it's one of the most important reasons why you need agents inside a translation workflow to cooperate instead of just chaining large language model calls, like I explained before. Um, when you have two specific requirements that might conflict with each other, and they one requirement would produce one type of output, and another requirement produces a different type of output. It's actually the orchestration layer that needs to resolve that, and that logic is something that we define upfront when building that workflow. So it's not a decision that we need to make during the pipeline. It's something that we think about. Okay, which requirement is more important? Which requirement trumps the other? Um, so we work together with our customer to understand what that decision tree kind of needs to look like. Um, so certain requirements are given priority order, so the orchestration layer knows which one takes precedence, should there be any conflict. And the conflict itself can become a signal as well. So that might be an exception that is then flagged, not necessarily breaking the workflow or anything, but it might be an exception that is flagged, that's then escalated to a human, and then they can decide, okay, next time in the translation pipeline, this is what we do. And that's a conflict that can then be resolved. You don't have to resolve it by actually going into the content and fixing the content. You resolve it by going into the workflow and deciding how it's handled in the future. And that's kind of goes back to human governance of AI execution as well. Do you have any comments on that, Sara?
No, I wouldn't have found better words for that.
Okay, good. I think we might have time for one more. Um, let's see here. What do you think the linguist of the future looks like? Considering that linguists are expected to become more and more the corrector by exception, similar to when translators became post editors. What's your opinion on that, Sara?
Right, right. So I think like linguist translators, that's I think what makes this industry one of the most resilient industries because I think we've seen change so often and also disruptive change. I think anyone in this industry has the right capabilities, skills, tools, and a mental readiness to really navigate this challenge and shift. Um, in this specific context for this question, I think the what we hear very often, I think the easy answer is that the linguist of the future is the prompt engineer or the new prompt engineer. So this is not necessarily what I would go for. I think it's far more than that. And I think the linguist of today or the near future or the new area we're talking about is anyways really extraordinary at something which AI doesn't still get that well or even is really bad at, which is understanding why. So why something is wrong and why something is good. So obviously an LM can produce a very fluent sentence and we've talked so often about context today. So obviously we can have the best context strategy for an LM to output the perfect translation. But a skilled linguist definitely can tell you that the sentence is, for example, technically correct, but it carries a connotation which is fundamentally wrong. So that kind of judgment, which is really culturally grounded, domain specific, and even aware, obviously, of the context. So that is really the strategic differentiator that I don't think it will go away that easily. So if anything, then it will be more about really shifting the value of the human and linguist from, again, managing repetitive tasks or again, worrying about the execution and the noise, more towards, again, doubling down on these really strategic differentiators that only the human linguist can bring. So the linguist that today spends like 70 or 80% of their time translating starter segments that have already been translated dozens of times before, and linguists that have to handle duplicates and the noise. That's really the fundamental shift that has to happen. So it's really about moving that strategic task and role back to where it really matters.
Definitely. I agree with that. I think I'm not as close to the actual linguistic process as I used to, but I am seeing more and more roles that have something to do with like language manager or things like that. And again, that comes back to governance, right? It comes back to owning the way that we want to translate this content, not owning the actual process. And that's where linguists will definitely have the most benefit and the most value there, I think, in that process. Okay, all right. I think we have answered all of our questions. There we go. Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining this session. We will, of course, as I said, share the recording with you. And if there are any questions that we didn't get to, we will answer them offline or get in touch and be able to answer them outside of this webinar. Thank you very much for your time, and we hope to speak at some point.
Thank you again
Thank
from
you,
my side,
Sara.
and thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.